Are we live? Say hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Hey.
So, hello, Facebook community. Let's see if we can see. Will it show? Nobody's watching yet, but that's okay. That's okay. Somebody hearted. That's so funny that it shows us some things and not all things. All right. So, we'll wait just a couple minutes. So a couple people are already streaming in. I'm going to post something on my Facebook Live, not just the business, just so that people know where to go. So we're going to be a double Facebook Live. Oh my God, it's going to be crazy. Hello, friends. If you are looking for the Facebook Live video with myself and my molecular biologist brother, you're going to need to go over to @HeadHeartTherapy. That's where you're going to find our live video, and we're going to be starting very shortly. See you soon. All right. Okay, well, people are showing up. Should we get started?
Oh, yeah,
What do you
sure.
think? Okay, so hello to everyone who is joining us. Thank you for being here. So for those of you who don't know and haven't met this person on my left, this is my brother. This is my brother Adam. And for at least for his entire life, he is a science genius. And every time there is a science thing happening, I always go to him and ask him what the hell is going on with this shit. And he does a really excellent job of explaining really complex things in a really easy to understand way. And we were talking the other night. I've been having a ton of anxiety going on through all of this, and so I called him, and my husband was about to go out to the store, and I was like, don't touch anything, and like, make sure you wipe everything down. I was being really crazy about it. So I called Adam to settle the dispute about exactly what Rich needed to do to keep us safe. And as we were talking, I started feeling more relieved just having information. And I told Adam, I said, like, I really wish that you would do a Facebook Live because I think you could be really helpful to a lot of people. And he agreed. OMG. So the purpose of our time together tonight really is Adam's going to answer some questions. We've compiled a list of what we think are pretty common questions. We've also compiled some from people who have commented on Facebook and Instagram. And if you have questions as he's going along, just type them into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. And then my job really is I really hope to support people in figuring out how do you take care of yourselves with all of this information that we're getting. So I'll be checking in from time to time just to see how people are feeling as Adam downloads all this information. So without further ado, let me get my handy dandy list. Well, I guess Adam, first, do you want to introduce yourself and your background in the field of science things?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Adam. Hi, everybody. My background is in molecular genetics. My degree is from Ohio State. And I mean, like Sarah said, I've basically been more or less a scientist my entire life. My mom always used to say my favorite word was why. So, I always want to find things out about nature. So I followed that into the sciences, and um, 11 of the past 13 years I've been in industry working as an oncology and infectious disease specialist. So I'm very well versed with the diagnostics behind the actual testing, and just the general science surrounding the disease and the virus itself.
Awesome. So first things first, how did this start? Where did coronavirus come from?
Okay, so coronavirus is an umbrella term because there are many coronaviruses, and this most recent virus is the seventh that we've identified that infects humans. It is the third, including the first SARS outbreak that was in 2002 and 3. The MERS outbreak in 2012, I believe, and then this is the third one that can cause serious disease. So SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. So that basically means you're in respiratory distress, you have trouble breathing, and can develop viral, which is primary pneumonia, or later on bacterial pneumonia. So there's a difference between, so you'll hear COVID-19
right.
and you'll hear SARS-CoV-2.
Right.
So those are two different things. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. COVID-19, it literally is coronavirus disease that was first categorized in 2019. So that's the disease from that. So think about HIV and AIDS.
Got
right?
it, yeah.
The virus is HIV, AIDS is the condition.
Yeah.
So we'll just, say that right now. Basically in December of 2019, doctors in Wuhan, China, in the Hubei province of central China, were seeing these cases of pneumonia that were coming up, and they were very severe. And that's not really normal, especially because they found what I would call radiation sites where families would be coming down with the same sickness. So they brought in epidemiologists, which study epidemics and the flow of data. They're basically Sherlock Holmes looking for where did this come from, and they localized they found a local market, which is referred to as a wet market, where they trade in live exotic animals. So it was basically there have been papers I've been reading that say if we continue to let these types of trade happen, that this is a ticking time bomb. So there were a couple, and I'll get to this later, but there are a couple animals, we call them animal reservoirs, because that's where the viruses essentially can combine and go between different species and between different animals themselves. So they make the jump between animals, then they make the jump to humans, and the final stage is jump from human to human, and that's what we think happened in Wuhan.
And can you explain the novel part of the virus? What is that exactly?
Yeah, this is a really, really important concept. Okay, so something like influenza. This is something that we've been dealing with. If we think about the influenza epidemic of 1918, the largest epidemic of the past century, this is a virus that we see. We have what we call flu season, right? Okay, so we've learned how to deal with that, and many of us can gain immunity through vaccination and means like that. Novel means new. Before this virus emerged, no single immune system on the planet had encountered it, and therefore no single person is immune. So that means that the entire world population is susceptible. The only way to gain immunity right now, in absence of a vaccine, is to be infected and recover.
And you were telling me about the Native Americans and smallpox, making that connection. Can you say that again? Because that was really that really put it into perspective for me.
Yeah, so if we think back to our early American history, when the settlers from Europe came over to the New World, North America, they spread a lot of disease. So we heard a lot of Native Americans being just decimated by smallpox, and then in Central and Southern America too, with the conquistadors from Spain. So in Europe, smallpox had become pretty much endemic, meaning that it was within the population, and that population had more or less gained immunity to it. Not to say it's still not a horrible disease and people continue to die from it, but when they brought that over to the New World, the population of Native Americans are what we call naive to the virus. So they have no immunity, and it decimated them. And they actually, you hear about smallpox blankets. They actually used it as a weapon. So that's essentially what we are seeing. Now, I'll touch on this too later. I mentioned the word weapon. I want to make it abundantly clear that this is not for all intents and purposes, no one could possibly have manufactured this because I have had people ask me, is this a virus that escaped the lab or is it a bioweapon? There have been studies and data that show that this is not the case.
That it's not a bioweapon.
Correct.
Right. So just kind of thinking back to the smallpox analogy too. So essentially, if we are in contact with it, will we get sick every time we would get in contact with it, or would we gain immunity at some point?
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the questions. So I'm going to just, make this, more basic because I can go down a crazy rabbit hole with, immunity in immunology. So basically, there are two types of immunity. You have your innate immunity and your adaptive immunity. Okay. So, say you get a cut and some bacteria gets in there. Your immune system immediately responds to it and sends signals that say, hey, there's something here, kill it. I don't know what it is, kill it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you're infected with, say, something like a virus or, bacteria, the system cascades down different molecular signals and things like that respond to what are called antigens, which are on the virus. So there's some form that is on the virus that is recognizable by your immune system.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
So what then happens is your immune system creates what are called memory cells. So you literally have cells in your body for measles, mumps, rubella, things like that, because, presuming you were vaccinated.
Right, that's how vaccines work. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They train your immune system to say, hey, if you see this, this is how you kill it, by creating antibodies. Mm-hmm. Okay, so antibodies will neutralize the virus. They essentially are tailor-made by your own immune system to hook onto the virus, and then other cells, killer cells, they're actually called that, macrophages, and different cells in the immune system essentially destroy it. So it can get under control very, very quickly. So the adaptive immune system is very, very strong. But if you're naive to it, like everyone is who hasn't been infected and recovered right now, it all you really have is your innate immunity. And unfortunately, based on the virulence of the virus, your innate immunity goes haywire.
Right.
And that's what is actually damaging to you. Your immune system goes into overdrive and can actually damage the lining of your lungs, which can lead to this viral pneumonia or later bacterial pneumonia, or even fibrosis of the lungs, where you have scar tissue build up inside your lungs and you can get fluid in your air sacs, which make it's hard to breathe, or get oxygen to the rest of your body. So that's really the quick and dirty on what that is.
But if you get it, let's just say I'm a carrier, and then does it work its way out of my system, and then am I immune from then on, or how does that work? Okay.
Yes.
So if you get this COVID-19 once, whether you're a carrier or whether you're symptomatic, then you build immunity.
Your immune system then knows what it needs to fight.
Awesome.
In the future. So
that's helpful.
So that's basically how you gain immunity to anything. So this virus included.
Yeah, and I see some folks writing in with some questions. I'm curious how people are feeling right now as we're getting some of this information. I think, getting clarity for me always helps with my anxiety. So if you want to type in a little chat how you're feeling while you're watching this, let me know. So back to the list of questions that we have. So you talked about where it came from, what novel means. Can you talk about why it's so aggressive and it can be passed so easily?
Yeah. So I'm sure everyone has seen in the news the pictures essentially of what the virus looks like. It's basically a ball with these spikes, with spikes sticking out.
More like
exactly. And those spikes, which they are actually called spike proteins, are what interact with receptors in your lung cells to gain entry to those cells and then replicate. In this particular version, as compared with the previous SARS, so the one in 2003 was SARS-CoV, and now this is SARS-CoV-2, because it shares 82% sequence homology, meaning it's 82% similar to the original virus, with a few very important changes. And there's been a paper, it's actually my favorite paper to come out of this whole thing. It's called, I can't read backwards, The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. Mm-hmm. So this is a correspondence between a group of scientists that essentially looked at the sequence of the genome of this novel virus and asked that question. Why is this so deadly? Mm-hmm. Why is this so easily transmitted? Mm-hmm. And what they found hints at the kind of teaser you had before this video where you said, what does coronavirus have to do with a pangolin?
Yeah.
Well, so if we go back to talking about those wet markets where they have exotic animals that are alive, keyword alive, so they're able to spread virus. They found 2 different animal reservoirs in 1 bats and 2 pangolins. The bats shared, you could basically look at the bats shared part of it, and the pangolins shared another part, and they probably recombined in either a bat or a pangolin that was then spread to a human. And then they go on in the paper to say maybe it changed before it spread, which is called a zoonotic transfer, meaning it goes from animals to humans, or it actually had selective pressure in humans, changed, and then was able to infect other humans. So in those spike proteins, what they found is that the piece that actually hooks on to the receptor in your lungs has a much higher affinity for that receptor. So imagine a giant steel door, and the old SARS comes at it like a limp-wristed grandma, and then this SARS comes at it like
go on,
like a football player, right? Who's going to gain entry more times? Well, it's going to be the football player. So that's essentially what this is the binding affinity of the spike protein in this virus has much higher affinity for our receptors.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that a friend of yours asked us to talk about is, if it's so aggressive, why does hand washing work?
Okay, so being aggressive just doesn't change the nature of what the virus actually is. So if we go back, we saw, we've seen that ball that has spikes in it. The spikes are proteins, and the ball itself is an envelope. So it's actually derived from the host cells that, the pieces of the virus get excreted out as functional virus. So essentially what that envelope is, it's a fatty layer. It's a phospholipid bilayer. So by using just soap, not even antibacterial, because this is a virus, so it has nothing to do with that.
Right.
Just the molecule of soap is what's called amphipathic. So it has a water-loving head, and then it has a tail that loves fats and oils. So essentially what it does is it will stick its tail into the virus, and then the head wants to be with water, so it faces outwards. So all the soap molecules congregate around it, and then by the actual act of washing your hands, and the friction disrupts that membrane, rendering the virus completely inactive. So, thorough hand washing as per CDC recommendations for that 20 seconds. There's actually a really good GIF I've seen out there of a guy, he takes a little dollop of black paint, and he starts rubbing his hands to show how you should actually be washing your hands. Because just by doing this, what about the back of your hands? What about your thumbs? What about, your wrists? So it's it's a really cool resource to kind of trace how to thoroughly wash your hands.
If you send that to me later, I'll post it so that people can see that. That's helpful. So, one of the things I've been freaking out about is when I go out, I obviously am doing the social distancing thing, but if I go to the store, I have this fear of, if I touch anything, essentially I'm infected. So can you talk a little bit about how careful we need to be when we're out in public and touching surfaces?
Yeah, so I have had a lot of questions about surface stability. So let me be clear that the main mode of transportation of this particular virus is respiratory droplets. So that's someone coughing, sneezing, even like talking in your face and little spit drops come out. That can cause infection. So, that is the main mode of infection in this virus. However, there has been a study by the New England Journal of Medicine. I've seen this quoted a lot. A lot of news outlets have said, "Oh, this exists for this long." So I actually read that paper, and what it did, it tested five different media, essentially, of like how this virus could be transported. Aerosols in the air itself, plastics, stainless steel, copper, and cardboard. So they do have a stratification on like how long. So for example, they could detect virus in aerosols for 3 hours. On plastics, they lasted the longest, up to 72 hours. Stainless steel, 48 hours, copper, 4 hours, and cardboard, 24 hours. Now, it's because you're like, oh, so if I touch that, I'm going to get infected.
Right.
Okay, as time progresses, the viral load went down. So, for example, on plastic, when they tested it right after they sprayed it, they had 5,000 copies of virus. At the end of that 72 hours, they could only find 4, which was at the limited detection of the actual test that they were using. So your risk is going to go down as a function of that too. So, if you touch something that someone like literally hacked on, there's going to be a lot of virus on that versus someone who just walked by and, maybe touched a jug of milk.
Okay.
So you just have to know your risk. The biggest risk is being within 6 feet of someone.
Right.
I mean, that is infected.
Right.
Because those respiratory droplets they just float in the air. I mean, they're everywhere right now.
Yeah.
It's just a function of being human.
Yeah.
So that's why they talk about, and I'll bring this up. So in the past 3 days, I have had contact with one person, and that was my own therapist. And she actually said, I don't really like the concept of social distancing. And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, it's physical distancing because we need to be as socially connected as possible right now. So I really like that. So I'll call it physical distancing.
Right.
So we need to physically distance ourselves.
Right.
I mean, think about, they always say, when you get your promise ring when you're in high school, the only way not to catch an STD or to get pregnant is abstinence, right?
Right.
If you're not infected and you don't leave your apartment, you will not get sick, barring some crazy, outlying story. There are two things that we need to work on right now, and that's not getting infected and not spreading the disease if you are infected.
Right.
Okay, that's our mission right now.
Yeah.
So we need to know how to achieve that, and that's through doing what the CDC says, right? I applaud Ohio right now.
Home state. What?
Mike DeWine and Dr. Amy Acton. Yeah, home state. I mean, they've enacted one of the most stringent, policies regarding the shelter in place and what you should be doing in closing down these non-essential businesses. I mean, it's better to do that in right now than waiting, because mitigation will end in much more infection.
Right. Well, this is a good question, and I just took a walk myself about an hour ago, and is there less risk if you're passing somebody outside? So let's say we're walking on sidewalks, and what are those, 3 feet wide maybe? Can we safely pass someone on a sidewalk, or should we really be going into the street, out of our way to not be crossing with people?
Yeah, I mean, we also, you just have to assess your risk. Is this person coughing? If someone was walking down the street and coughing at me without covering their face right now, I would walk into the street. But for example, I said I was in contact with one person for an extended period of time, but I had to get something from my car about an hour ago. and I passed two people in my apartment. And you know, like, everyone's on edge right now. We all looked in each other's eyes and we're like, are you, you know, like, we had that, yeah. Like, if someone was sniffling and coughing, I would back away from them. You know, that's just me. But I understand the risk and how it's spread.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of all of this spreading, can you talk about what flattening the curve means?
Yeah. So, I'm sure many of you have heard the term flatten the curve, and that kind of is a follow up from, you know, what we were talking about, you know, mitigation efforts and things like that. So, if we were to just, and I've heard some people say this, let the virus run its course, that would be absolutely catastrophic, both for the health of the nation and socioeconomically.
Right.
Because we only have so many beds per 1,000 Americans, okay? And that's a lot lower than you think it is. And I'm not saying that to scare you, but we have to maintain the integrity of our healthcare systems, because if they collapse, then it's going to be even worse. So imagine we just let it run its course and, you know, let's say half of Americans got sick, 150 million people. We would be under the healthcare system would be under so much stress, and there would literally only be enough ventilators, because that's a finite resource.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing in Italy right now, where the tough decisions have to be made, right? So if we do this extreme social physical distancing, and closing businesses, it's not going to be fun for the next couple weeks.
Right.
But it's going to be a lot more fun in 18 months.
Right.
So what that does is, instead of having everybody go into the healthcare system, people more or less trickle into the healthcare system over a longer space of time rather than that tiny bit of time, because the virus is very infectious. And one of the unfortunate things is the incubation period, the time from when you were exposed to the virus to when you show symptoms, if at all.
Right.
It's a wide range. For example, I have, you know, written down here, the incubation for flu is 1 to 4 days for influenza. But incubation for this virus is 2 to 14.
Yeah.
So that's why we see a lag in the data, is because people are being exposed, but they're not yet sick, so they don't have to go to the hospital.
Right.
So, you know, we're at the point where I don't know what we crossed as far as infection rates are, but you know, they're not looking very good right now. We've since surpassed Iran, Germany, and Spain to become the third most affected country in the world. All right?
Yeah.
So we are adding more cases. We are number one on cases per day.
Yeah. And I want to check in with folks at this point, because this is the stuff that is really scary, right? And I think, you know, Adam and I talked about this earlier. This is not meant to be, we're not intending to scare people, but we're intending to really let people know what the truth is and how serious this really is. So I just kind of want to check in with people's anxiety right now. So type in and let us know how you're feeling. We did get one question that is sort of around this topic. So Jess says, how do you recommend responding to younger and or healthy people who are not practicing physical distancing? If you want to talk about that from the science perspective, and then I'll talk about it from the mental health perspective.
Yeah, and I think frankly you're going to do a better job of it, because it's disgusting.
Yeah.
The video that went viral of the spring breakers in Florida that said, "If I get it, I get it."
Yeah.
I just turned 21. We've been planning this trip for 3 months. Okay, there are two things you need to think about in an epidemic. There's personal risk, and then there's systemic risk. So they're basically saying my personal risk is 0, and they're saying F you to the systemic risk, which is if I infect another person or 2 people or 5 people, they're going to continue infect other people, and those will infect the at-risk population, being the older people and people with comorbidities, which are things like, you know, heart disease, diabetes, you know, cardiac problems, things like that. Because if you're putting an immense amount of stress on an already strained system, it's harder for the body to fight off the virus.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, as far as it's concerned, is scientifically, those are the two things that you need to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm young and healthy, so my personal risk is low, but I have a civic responsibility to not spread this virus. So, being in large groups, or I've even seen people have COVID parties.
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
So people need to know that, and that's the information I would share with them, because that's the truth.
Yeah. And from the mental health perspective, like I 2 weeks ago, I was saying like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Like, I'm going to be fine if I get it, whatever. And it really wasn't until I got more information that I understood really what my part in this was. And so, I think inviting people into conversation is really important when we're having divergent views. I've also had conversations with friends of mine this week where they've got family members who are, first of all, they might not be on social media. They might not have access to that in the same way that we do. And secondly, if we're in a culture where you're supposed to respect your elders, but your elders aren't, doing the thing that they're supposed to do to keep everybody safe, it can be really, really hard to communicate this information. But as much as we can, and I think about trying to create connection when it's difficult to do so, it's a call in instead of a call out, right? So, I mean, and truth be told, like, this is easier said than done. Like, I'm pissed at the spring breakers, and I'm aghast. I see people are still having church services and all sorts of things, and it pisses me off personally. But when I'm able to kind of pull back and really think about why people make these choices, it truly is they don't have the information. And if I come at it with, you idiot, like, you're doing it wrong, like, that's not really going to invite change. So if it's at all possible to say, hey, like, can we really have a heart to heart about this? I think it's going to depend on your relationship with the person, but as much as you can invite in and think about connection instead of calling out, I think that's just the best we can do. But unfortunately, a lot of people aren't going to listen, and it's tragic. It's truly tragic. Yeah. Well, thanks. You guys are giving us some great questions here. And Adam, I just want to let you know too, a lot of people are saying that, the information is easing their anxiety and they're finding it really, really helpful. So I think
good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I'm so glad too. Let me see what other questions we've got going on. What about vaccines? How long do you think it'll take to create a vaccine?
All right. Yeah, this is probably one of the most asked questions. We already talked about innate versus adaptive immunity, right? So what a vaccine is doing is it's introducing these viral particles into the system so that your body can build up adaptive immunity via those memory cells, where they start pumping out antibodies as soon as they detect this virus. So there are actually different kinds of vaccines. I'll just touch on them briefly. Mm-hmm. So the most effective are live attenuated vaccines. So that's a weakened version of the virus, but it is virus. It's just non-symptomatic. Mm-hmm. So a good example of that is your MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. Okay. So once you get that, you're essentially set for life. But then we have other vaccines. Main point, with a live attenuated vaccine, you can't give it to someone immunocompromised.
Right.
Because, yeah. So that's dangerous, and that's against protocol for doctors. Then there's inactivated vaccines, where you essentially take these viruses and you inactivate them, most usually with heat. So they're all inactivated.
Put them in the oven.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, this is like polio, okay, or hepatitis A. Mm-hmm. And these are not as effective, but you can give them to immunocompromised people because there's absolutely no risk of actually developing it. And this is why we have booster shots when we're kids, because you're doing a little salt bay, on the immune system. Yeah, but it needs to be, it's not the full response that a live attenuated virus is. Then there are things like subunit vaccines, which influenza is a great example of one. So we talked about the spikes in coronavirus. Well, flu has its own types of spikes. So it has two that we're worried about. So when you hear a flu strain, you usually hear H1N1 or H5N2. So these are the different versions of the spikes. So we basically will manufacture these vaccines with the different spikes so that your immune system can recognize those for that particular flu season. That's why every flu shot's different every season. It's because they essentially have to be made based on surveillance data throughout the flu season. So that comes to, well, what kind of virus or what kind of vaccine could we make with this? Well, we have to think about public safety. You know, we can't just say, I'm going to grab the virus, I'm going to put it in the oven and then just inject it into someone. You know, there have to be trials that are done, and vaccines can take dozen years to be made, 8, 10, 12, 15 years, because they have to go through the rigors of testing and validation. There is a company in Seattle that's making a different, interesting type of vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine. So this virus is, it doesn't have DNA in it, it has RNA. So it, instead of injecting virus, it's injecting RNA into the patient. So that the thought is, that I understand, is that this piece of code will be translated into these proteins that will create an immunity response. So they're actually making progress. But you know, if we're talking, like, we've only known about this virus for 3 months, right? So we have to keep that in mind. And there has been unprecedented amounts of data published. We got the genome sequenced in January in China, and we hadn't even known it was a problem a month prior. So, you know, we have to keep that in mind. Most estimates that I see, you know, and this, you know, take it as it is, but the most amount of time, I guess, is we're looking at probably 1 to 2 years for a vaccine. Some people are more optimistic and some people are more pessimistic. But what's going on with this company in Seattle is they're together with the FDA right now, because a lot of diagnostics companies are getting what's called EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization, EUA, yes.
Yeah.
So what that is like, okay, we're the FDA and we have to validate everything you do, but if you can provide a list of, like, at least it does this, we'll release it to the public because this is an emergency.
Right.
So I think 5 companies have diagnostic tests that are on the market now. So people, you know, the tests are starting to roll out. So you will see an increase in the number of cases because just more people are getting tested. New York is a perfect example.
Right.
Like a week ago, they had a couple thousand cases, and now they have like
15,000. Right.
It's because more people are getting tested. So, you know, we're looking at like 1 to 2 years for a vaccine, which can confer immunity. That's not to say we won't have therapeutics, okay? There was a study that was done on 2 different drugs. There's remdesivir, which is an antiviral. It's a broad-spectrum antiviral, which means it works on a lot of different viruses. And then chloroquine, which is an old drug that was used. It's an anti-malarial drug, so to keep people from catching malaria. So this study actually found these 2 drugs to be effective against SARS-CoV-2. However, so obviously, why aren't we giving this to everyone? Well, their study was done in vitro, which means in glass. So it was done in a test tube and not in vivo or in life in something living, like a human or even a mouse. Gilead, who makes remdesivir, is actually shipping remdesivir to Seattle and China for them to start trials. So in the meantime, we may be able to suppress the effects of the virus via these two therapeutics, but this is only one study.
Right.
And also, I talked about the emergency use authorization. A lot of papers are being sent as correspondences rather than actual full publications because they don't necessarily have peer review.
There's no time for that right now.
Because it's going to take months to go through peer reviews. So they're saying, look, this is our data, right?
Fuck your peer review.
Yeah, so they can publish it that way. And,
right.
I imagine all of these will go through full peer review at some point in time.
Right.
But the fact is we need data and we need it now.
Yeah. So there are a couple good questions that came in, and Angela asked, essentially, are we going to be in this state of living until there is a vaccine? And obviously you're not like predicting the future, but given what you know about this,
it all depends on our behavior. We will determine that. Every single one of us.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
If we bring the hammer down and say, look, you can only go out once a week to get groceries, wear a mask, or, right now the healthcare system needs the PPE or personal protective equipment like masks, gloves, gowns, and things like that. But, we may come to a point where, that becomes available if we do flatten the curve substantially. What we're doing right now is we're lagging behind Europe, which lagged behind China. Right. So what we're seeing in Europe now is what we're going to be seeing in 11 to 14 days. And so China has actually completely flattened the curve. They only have a trickle of new infections every day compared to what they were. They had about 81,000 infections cumulatively. But what they did is they took extreme suppression methods, like basically saying, one person can leave the household 1 day a week to get essential items, no hoarding, no, none of this. They put a kibosh on that immediately, because they saw what was going on. What South Korea did is contact tracing. So if I go out, and like I said, in the past 3 days, I've had substantial contact with one person, and I know that, right? So if you're going out and having, contact where you're maybe within that 6 feet for, a more prolonged period of time, or something like that, that's what they did. They took epidemiologists and had them literally sit down with these patients and say, who did you come in contact with the past 14 days? And they put those people in quarantine.
Wow.
Okay, this is what we need to be doing. So strict infection quarantine. If you are infected, you ain't going anywhere. And if you're a PUI or a person under investigation, you need to be quarantined as well. And some places are setting up like triage and quarantine, like little some places like here in Georgia, we have a little like village outside of Atlanta that's set up for people in quarantine who could not otherwise quarantine themselves at home.
Wow.
Vanderbilt has set up a pre-admitting. It's basically they set up a mobile. It's not mobile. They set up an external from the main hospital in their parking garage. So they literally took an entire, level of a parking garage, put down, linoleum flooring, put in beds, stocked it up for people so that if they are infected, they can be immediately quarantined and not risk infecting the other people, because that would be the worst case, because we also have to think about the impact of people other than COVID patients, right?
Right.
If we flood the health system with, 1,000 COVID patients and there are 1,000 beds, what about the guy who has a heart attack, the person who goes into shock, the person who is in a car accident, a shooting, all of those people? These decisions will have to be made on essentially who's going to live and who's going to die.
Right. So we've got, here's kind of a quick question, and then there's a longer question that I think is really interesting. So Margaret says, if we go to the store for food, should we wear masks and gloves? And if we don't have them, I'm wondering if we wear a scarf.
Yeah, and I mean this is a question that is common. I mean, there are different kinds of masks. Like there are those, kind of the square surgical masks versus like an N95
Right.
mask, which is
Closed, actually, right?
yeah, it's closed and is rated. It won't let anything smaller than 5 microns through, the filter. I mean, these, a mask prevents you from giving off respiratory droplets, and it does prevent, in many cases, respiratory droplets from being inhaled by you. So, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but, I would say that, if you do go out in public, I have seen many people wearing both types of masks. And, in the SARS outbreak in 2003, everyone in Asia Pacific was wearing a mask. So, I mean, I don't think at this point it could hurt as long as we have ample supply for the healthcare workers who are on the front line. They need it more.
Right, yeah. And then Caitlin has a really good question. She said, can you speak to what we could see in a second wave curve if social distancing doesn't continue? With the administration potentially lifting precautions sooner than anticipated, it's concerning to think about the implications of workplaces and other places of business reopening.
Yeah, that would not be good. I mean, we talked about flattening the curve. So the curve has many different trajectories, right? So if we do absolutely nothing, that would be the absolute worst case, where we literally have millions and millions of people infected. So if we do kind of this in between, where we're like, yeah, you can do what you want, but cover your cough and wash your hands, that kind of thing, I don't think that's enough. So I had mentioned the governor of Ohio and like what he has done in the state, and I think that's the best example that we have yet in the United States right now. We also look to the other countries and what they did. Like I talked about in Asia Pacific, the very stringent methods that they took to just suppress this virus. And we also have I had mentioned that what we're seeing in Europe is essentially what we're going to see here in the next 10 to 14 days. We can also learn from their mistakes. I mean, there are people in Europe right now, in Italy, who is the second most affected country in the world after China. I don't know if you've seen, it's been trending, but Italians essentially making videos for themselves 10 days in the past.
Right.
So they're saying, you should have done this, you should have done that, and they're talking to themselves.
Yeah.
Those are very impactful because that's exactly what we need to hear.
Right.
And the actual patients who are doing their own videos, who are in ICU, who are saying, do not take this lightly.
Right.
That's extremely important. So, that's the kind of information that I feel we need to be sharing, because there is so much misinformation out there.
Right.
So, I talked about primary sources, right? So, if you saw it on your news, I guarantee you your news station did not do that study. So do some research and look for the primary sources, right? So, the Surface study was the New England Journal of Medicine. It's a pretty straightforward study. It says, look, plastics up to 72 hours, but the actual active virus decreased as a function of time. Like, or, if you have a healthcare industry friend or something, say, hey, what does this mean? Or something like that. And there are more credible sources than others. So we need to be doing what's called horizontal research, which is not just seeing a fantastic headline and just sharing it right away. You have to validate that information. And it's up to all of us to actually do that, because you're going to be spreading this information, which will impact people's lives. Because if they believe that, they can do a certain thing, like...
We saw a thing with gargling salt water, right?
Okay.
Somebody
Yeah, there you go.
had posted that, and I saw that, and I texted Adam right away, and I said, what do you think of this? Does this work? And he looked it up and was like, no, this actually doesn't work. And so I sent a message. Again, this kind of speaks to the calling in instead of calling out. So, you know, I saw that on this person's Facebook, and I could have been like, you idiot, that doesn't work, and da 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 da. But instead I sent this person a Facebook message, and I just said, hey, I just wanted to let you know that this information that you posted actually wasn't accurate, and luckily this person was.
And here's a source.
Yeah, and here's a source, and this person was gracious enough to say thank you, and then they took that down. So I think that's a good example of, you know, fact checking. Like, I don't know, Adam, maybe you want to give your email to people so they can ask you questions, but like, I have my science expert who I call to actually check these things out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well,
because and we just have to realize that the scientists don't know everything either.
Right.
I mean, this is going to be constantly evolving.
Right. Absolutely. So here's a question that's been coming up a lot. I've seen people talk about, should we worry about the virus mutating?
Okay. Short answer, no, not really. It's not going to mutate into some super virus right now. It's damaging enough as it is. You know, that paper that I had mentioned about the origin of the virus and finding that those spikes on the virus have such an affinity for our cells receptors right now. I mean, it was basically a perfect storm of, you know, things that happen in recombination, different animal reservoirs. So, as far as, like, you know, mutating, yes, the virus mutates as it moves through the population. Every virus is going to do that, but let me just put it in perspective. The reason we don't have an HIV vaccine is because that virus is crazy mutable.
Right.
Okay? It's like having a drunk fifth grader try to transcribe James Joyce's Ulysses versus having a
Go on.
New York Times editor with proofreading capability, right?
Yeah.
Because that's actually something that exists in certain cells, and viruses have the capability of conferring proofreading. So if they make a mistake when they're transcribing, they actually have a mechanism to go back and correct that. This virus actually has a form of that, but HIV is like that drunk fifth grader.
We don't like underage drinking, do we? Inside joke. Sorry, guys. Okay, so there were a couple specific questions that came up on Facebook that, and these are kind of like really getting into the details of it, that I think important to talk about. So if someone has been exposed to a different strain of coronavirus, does it diminish the severity of symptoms should they contract this coronavirus?
Okay, and I'm going to go straight to my phone here, because I have a quote. I mean, I went through the literature and I found this one paragraph and I was like, this is the answer. Okay. I'll try to kind of keep this down, but it says several studies suggest that antibodies against non-SARS coronaviruses are prevalent. Okay. Meaning that someone got infected by another coronavirus, like one that causes the common cold. I said there are 7 that affect humans, only 3 of which cause SARS or MERS, okay? So you could have been infected by those other 4 viruses, just had the sniffles, and then therefore you have the antibodies for it. So these studies suggest that we may have a degree of protective immune response. However, there is no clear evidence on whether and how prior exposure to a strain of coronavirus could produce permanent immunity across species of strains, or even cross immunity for other coronaviruses. So basically what they're saying is we don't know. We do know because we probably haven't tested this yet, like, you know, seeing, because that's a huge study. That study would take a long time to do. because you would need to study different populations of people who have and haven't been infected with coronavirus. You'd have to do immunological studies on whether they have these antibodies or not. So that's one thing, is like it's proposed, but we don't know yet because that's a huge study.
Well, here's another deep question. So I think this was Mihaela that said it. I read coronavirus started to be researched in the early 90s. How much now do we know about it, and what other possible mutations maybe seen? Well, actually, you talked about that. Never mind. We're going to skip that one. We already did that.
And just to touch on it, we actually first described coronavirus. I think they were first characterized in the 60s, and I think we first started like working on them in the 50s. So we have known about them for a while, but just keep in mind, coronavirus is a huge
it's an umbrella.
Right. There are alpha, beta, gamma, delta viruses, and then there are several under those. So it's a very broad term. It's like saying a tiger is a kitty. You know, it's
it is
feline.
It's a kitten.
Yeah. Well.
You're kitty. Okay. Here's an interesting question. There was an article came out saying that with blood types, type A had more severe symptoms than type O, and it looked like these other blood types were impacted significantly less. Are they talking a straight percentage of the people tested, or are they normalizing the result because of fewer people have type AB blood than, say, O?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a really good question. So this was a very recent study that was trying to link your ABO blood group to essentially if you would contract it, if you're more susceptible to it, or if you would have worse symptoms. Like if you came in contact with the virus, would you actually get COVID versus being like asymptomatic or just having some sniffles. So the study was very interesting, and they did kind of go through the scientific rigor. This again was a correspondence, so it was not peer reviewed. And they did find that the A group blood groups, which I'm a neg, so of course
too.
I was
interested.
Oh my god. So I looked into that, and I did some more horizontal research, which was I looked at metadata. Well, not metadata. I looked at people talking about the paper. So scientists that were actually talking about it, not just the paper itself.
Right.
And there was one doctor, I believe in India, who, and this really brought it home and completely quelled my anxiety about it, because I was like, oh my gosh, A groups, I gotta stay. I'm going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And he said this. He basically said, yes, the data seems sound, but what they've shown was they essentially showed the effect and not any causal relationship. So did that cause this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
So there's what we call like a spurious argument or something, where you're saying like, look, we can make data do whatever we want.
Right.
There's actually a website that links crazy things together, like the number of pirates in the world with swimming pool deaths. So like we can find correlation.
Right.
Correlation, not causality. So you do see a correlation in the data. But he basically said, like, it's interesting and warrants further research, but right now we just don't know enough. But yeah, that is an interesting study, because it's really crazy, like how many angles people are taking all these different things. From one person saying, look, we think a bat and a pangolin were in close quarters and essentially cause this virus to recombine and create what we're seeing now, to someone saying, does your blood type confer, more infectivity to you?
Yeah. Well, we've been doing this for an hour, but there are still 30 people watching, so we're going to keep going until we run out of questions or until everybody goes away, if that's cool. So this is kind of two questions. How do we understand the shift in symptoms with more added recently, like stomach pain, back pain, and then also the shift in age and gender groups? I read today that in New York City, a majority of the cases are between men 18 to 49 years old. So two questions there.
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as the symptoms, we have to think about majority symptoms versus minority symptoms. So, in essentially the WHO in China released a publication where, I mean, they categorized the overall arching symptoms, which are fever, dry cough, fatigue, sputum production, which is essentially the junk that's in your lungs, dyspnea, which is trouble breathing, and then there's like headache, diarrhea. So we're going from like 85% or 88% of people presenting with fever down to, some of the much less prevalent ones saying like, back pain or things like that. So, what we're looking for is a trend and a common denominator among all these patients. And then as far as the demographics are from the same publication, they say, and once again, this is probably isn't even true right now because this publication was in the past. It's always going to be changing because, based on a community that gets infected, what are the demographics of that community? I know there was a nursing home that had an infection go rampant, and unfortunately there were lots of deaths in that. So based on this study, which was done in late February, the median age was 51 of infection, and the majority of cases were between 30 years and 69 years old. So, I mean, that's just what we're looking at. We are seeing more of a mortality increasing with age. So the mortality rate increases as you are older. And some past epidemics, like the 1918 epidemic, had a quadratic curve, which is U-shaped. So you have young people, very young people, and very old people. But right now we just see this kind of curve going on.
Well, that's actually, Christy had a question about that. So she said she read one article that had a theory that since kids are frequently exposed to coronavirus more than adults, is partly the reason that they're not showing as frequent or severe infection.
And I mean, that goes back to my comments on the antibodies. If you were infected by another coronavirus, does that confer more resistance? And I think they even brought that up. They said, like, this may explain why children are not being as affected as older people.
Yeah. And Darren asks, any truth to the loss of taste and smell at the start of infection?
I have heard that. I have not looked into it. So I mean, I really don't want to speculate on that. But I have heard there have been rumblings of that. So, I mean, that's something I can further look into and provide an answer. And I mean, like I said, this is going to be ongoing. Right. So as questions continue, are you going to have the same questions now as you will in 10 to 14 days?
Right.
They're going to be totally different because we're going to be in a different place.
We'll have to do this again. Right?
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
We'll see how the response is to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've consistently had at least 25 people hanging out, and people are asking a lot of really great questions. Let me just see if there's anything else. So we kind of touched on this earlier, but I think let's be really specific about it. Christy asked, how long do people need to completely quarantine after a positive diagnosis or suspected positive?
Okay. I'm sure there are probably regulations on this. You've probably heard 2 weeks, and I think the conservative is 3 weeks for quarantine without serious symptoms. Because if you were to develop viral or bacterial pneumonia, you would probably, well, you would almost certainly need to be hospitalized, and you would probably be there longer than that. But I believe as a general, I'm healthy, no existing comorbidities, let the virus, run through my system. I believe that is the case, that in the majority of all cases, the virus is cleared within 3 weeks.
Right. And I've been seeing that they're actually saying if you are a young and healthy person in general and you come down with any of these symptoms, just stay home. Don't even go to the hospital unless you're actually having trouble breathing, right?
Yes. Unless you're in respiratory distress,
right.
You do not need to go to the hospital.
Right.
Yeah, because, you're potentially putting others at risk who are in higher risk groups, and you're also taking the resources away from those who need them more.
Right.
So, unless you are having, a severe reaction where you are having trouble breathing, exactly what you said.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any other questions coming in right now, and we've gone just over an hour. So, unless anybody else has anything that they want to ask, I wanted to end by grounding, really. And this was a big information dump, and I'm sure that some of you may have even more questions after this. Adam, are you willing for people to contact, are you willing to let people contact you if they have questions?
Let's figure out offline, like a route that we can take.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll post something after this video is over, once Adam figures out which way he would like to be contacted. Yes, Kendra, I'm hoping that I'll be able to capture this and also put it on YouTube and keep it on Facebook. So I hope that, people will be able to watch it again and you'll be able to share. So let's just end with grounding, and the way that I suggest we do that. If you can put your feet on the floor, try to do so. If not, you can just feel your butt in the seat, feel your back against the back of the chair. And one thing I like to do is really think about the line of energy that kind of comes from above, and then think about it connecting down to the core of the earth. And just feel yourself sitting here right now, and since you've come to join us, thank yourself for creating space for you to gain some more information. And a lot of people are already saying thank you, and we appreciate you being here. And if you have any other feedback or other questions, somebody else, Lisa, already said yes, you have to do this again in 10 to 15 days. So maybe we will. And if you've got more questions, you can definitely post on my page, my personal page, or Head Heart's page, and we'll let you know how to get in contact with Adam. But I think that's it, friends. Alrighty. Take care. How do I even...
Thanks, everybody.
I don't know how to turn this off. Maybe we'll just have to stay live because I don't know how to, I don't know how to stop it. Oh my God. This is the best part, right? I literally don't know how to stop this. Oh, there it is. The button was hiding. Okay. Bye, guys.